Patricia O'Dwyer, O. Cambridge. Known for its ancient colleges, cobbled streets, and quiet riverside beauty. But in 2024, the city became the backdrop for a brutal act of family betrayal. At the heart of it, Patricia O'Dwyer, a woman who, in a frenzied moment of violence, turned on her own sister with a knife. It began inside a modest home, away from the grandeur of the city's tourist postcards. Two sisters, long-standing tensions, and an argument that boiled over into horror. Patricia O'Dwyer, middle-aged, volatile, consumed by anger, snapped. She grabbed a knife from the kitchen, and with terrifying ferocity, she launched into a savage attack on her own sister. The assault was described by police as frenzied. Dozens of thrusts, blades slashing through the air, connecting again and again. Blood spattered the walls. The scene looked less like a family dispute and more like something from a horror film. Neighbors heard the screams. They dialed 999. When officers stormed the house, they found Patricia standing over her sister, the weapon slick with blood. Her victim was barely alive. She was rushed to hospital in critical condition. Somehow, miraculously, she survived the initial onslaught. But the emotional scars were irreversible. A family bond had been carved apart with steel. Patricia showed no remorse. During interviews, she admitted what she had done, but refused to explain why. Investigators pieced together fragments: jealousy, bitterness, and years of toxic tension between the sisters. But one thing was undeniable: the sheer brutality of the attack. Prosecutors told the court this was not a single flash of temper. This was rage unleashed, violence without pause, intent without mercy. The trial gripped Cambridge. Ordinary people struggled to comprehend how one sister could nearly kill another in such a vicious, intimate way. In court, Patricia sat silent, expression flat. As jurors heard the testimony, doctors described the extent of the injuries, wounds so deep they would haunt the victim for life. Police officers described the blood-soaked scene. The verdict was swift: guilty. The judge's words were sharp. This was an act of savage betrayal, carried out in the very home that should have been a place of safety. Patricia O'Dwyer was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, ensuring she would spend years behind bars for the attempt on her sister's life. The victim's life would never be the same. She had survived the knife, but at a cost, both physically and emotionally. The sister she once trusted had tried to take her life, and the community, shaken. In a city known for scholarship and beauty, a family feud had turned into something unthinkable. Marie Metcalfe. In November 2023, the quiet town of Hartlepool on England's northeast coast woke up to a story of betrayal that felt almost impossible to comprehend. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a thief. It was a sister who turned a family home into a killing ground. Her name was Marie Metcalfe. Marie and her sister, Laura Metcalfe, had grown up together in Teesside. Sisters separated by a few years, but bound by the chaotic intensity of family life. To outsiders, they looked like any siblings' arguments, reconciliations, rivalries, moments of laughter mixed with tension. But beneath the surface, there was a powder keg. On the night of November 6th, it exploded. In the cramped kitchen of their home, Marie and Laura's argument spiraled out of control. Shouting turned into threats, and then into violence. Marie grabbed a knife. With a sudden, frenzied burst of rage, she drove it into Laura. The blade tore into her body as she tried to defend herself. Blood spattered across the tiled floor. The home that once held birthday dinners and family meals was now a scene of carnage. Neighbors reported hearing screams, a woman crying out in agony. By the time emergency services arrived, Laura was barely clinging to life. Paramedics rushed her to hospital. Doctors fought to save her. For a few days, there was hope. Machines beeped, lines dripped, surgeons worked tirelessly. But the wounds were too deep, the damage too catastrophic. Laura Metcalf died. And with her death, the tragedy became something even darker. A murder investigation where the suspect was her own sister. When police interviewed Marie, the picture that emerged was one of resentment and volatility. This wasn't a carefully planned crime. It was an eruption. But the brutality of the attack left no room for leniency. The court heard how Marie, in a fit of rage, crossed a line that no family can ever return from. Her own sister's life ended at the point of a kitchen knife. The jury convicted her of murder. The judge handed down the ultimate punishment available, life imprisonment, with a minimum term before release. Inside the courtroom, family members wept. They had lost Laura forever. And they had lost Marie too, this time not to death, but to the bars of a prison cell. Deborah Patton. In the sunlit suburbs of Carrollwood, Florida, nestled in the Tampa Bay area, life seemed quiet, almost idyllic. But behind the closed doors of one home, a storm was building. In 2022, police would uncover a tragedy so chilling that it continues to haunt the community. A woman was dead, and the prime suspect was her own sister. Her name was Deborah Patton. To friends and neighbors, Deborah was just another middle-aged woman living an ordinary life. But investigators allege that she carried a secret darker than anyone could have imagined. The victim was Karen Pace, Deborah's sister. Karen was well known in her circle, a woman who had lived her life with resilience, who loved her family, who had dreams and routines like anyone else. But in September of that year, she was found dead under suspicious circumstances. When officers began their investigation, suspicion quickly turned inward, and soon all eyes were on Deborah. Authorities believe that Deborah was directly connected to her sister's death. Exactly how the crime unfolded remains at the heart of an ongoing legal battle. What is clear, however, is that prosecutors brought charges against Deborah, alleging she played a direct role in Karen's violent end. The details were harrowing. Early reports suggested a struggle, a confrontation that escalated far beyond words. When investigators examined the scene, they believed they were looking not at an accident, but at a homicide. Deborah was arrested. From that moment, the story spiraled into a storm of legal proceedings. Court documents revealed that Deborah's case was immediately complicated by questions of competency. Was she mentally fit to stand trial? Judges ordered evaluations. Psychiatrists examined her. Hearings were held. For months, the courtroom became a battlefield not just over what happened that day, but over whether Deborah even understood the process unfolding around her. At one stage, she was ruled incompetent to proceed. Treatment was ordered, and then, slowly, the case edged forward again toward trial. The prosecution insists that Deborah deliberately took her sister's life. The defense argues otherwise, suggesting her mental state clouds the picture. And so, In Florida, the story of two sisters remains unfinished. One lies in the grave, Karen, whose life ended far too soon. The other sits in custody, awaiting a trial that could seal her fate forever. The tragedy has already ripped the family apart. Friends of the sisters describe the shock, the disbelief. How could sibling rivalry, however intense, escalate into a killing? How could two lives, bound by blood, end in one's death and the other's imprisonment? The case continues, and until the trial delivers its final verdict, the story of Deborah Patton and Karen Pius lingers in a state of limbo. But the allegation alone carries its own weight, that in Tampa Bay, one sister may have crossed the unthinkable line and killed her own flesh and blood. Sarah Erickson. In the small town of Millville, tucked inside Cape May County, New Jersey, 2023 began with a story so grim it shocked even hardened investigators. A sister was dead. Another stood accused, and the bond of family was once again revealed as fragile, breakable, and fatally dangerous. Her name was Emily Cruddas. Just 33 years old, Emily was known in her community for her warmth and kindness. She had friends, family, and a life that, like so many others, was cut short in a single night of violence. Police were called to the scene after a disturbance was reported. When they arrived, they found Emily dead. The manner of her death pointed clearly toward homicide, and within hours, suspicion turned close to home. The alleged killer, her own sister, Sarah Erickson. Sarah was arrested, charged in connection with Emily's death. Authorities did not mince words. This was no accident. This was not a random attack. The evidence, they claimed, led directly back to Sarah. The brutality of the crime stunned the town. Emily had been found with severe injuries, consistent with a violent assault. The kind of attack that leaves no doubt of intent. In the aftermath, prosecutors built their case around witness statements, forensic evidence, and Sarah's own behavior before and after the killing. As the details trickled out, the portrait of that night grew darker. Family arguments, jealousy, resentment, all of it boiled beneath the surface of the Erickson household, until one night it erupted. Emily never walked away. Sarah was taken into custody, charged with murder. The courtroom in Cape May County became the stage where this family tragedy played out in public view. Journalists filled the benches. Family members wept, and the community struggled with the sheer enormity of it. In hearings, prosecutors emphasized the ferocity of the attack. They described the killing as deliberate, vicious, and cruel. The defense, meanwhile, sought to soften the image of Sarah, suggesting stress, turmoil, and desperation may have played their roles. But the fact remained: Emily was dead, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her, silenced forever. And Sarah stood accused of ensuring it. For the community, the shock ran deep. People who had known both sisters could hardly reconcile the image of family dinners, childhood memories, and shared laughter with the image of a crime scene soaked in blood. As the case progressed through the courts, the reality settled in. There would be no healing. A conviction would mean Sarah spends the rest of her life behind bars. An acquittal would not bring Emily back. One way or another, the Erickson family would remain broken. The tragedy of Emily's death lies not only in her loss, but in who allegedly took her life: a sister, a confidant, a person she should have been safe with. Millville will remember Emily, and it will remember the horror of 2023 when the Erickson home became a crime scene and the meaning of sisterhood turned deadly. Monica Pennington, Middletown, Ohio. A working-class community, steady, modest. A place where people knew their neighbors and family ties ran deep. But behind the familiar faces and quiet streets, a storm was building inside the Pennington household, one that would end in tragedy, insanity, and headlines that no one could ignore. The name at the center of it all, Monica Pennington. To those who knew her, Monica was complicated. She was troubled, struggling with mental health issues, and battling demons that most people never saw. Her sister, on the other hand, was described as caring, loving, a stabilizing presence. Two women tied by blood but divided by turmoil. For years, there were whispers of tension, arguments that turned loud, resentment simmering beneath the surface. But no one expected that resentment to turn into murder. The night it happened is still seared into the memory of Middletown. Police were called to the Pennington home after a violent altercation. When they entered, what they found was horrifying. Monica's sister lay dead. The scene showed the brutality of the attack, an eruption of violence that tore the family apart. Monica was arrested, charged with killing her own sister. The community was stunned. How could a sister, someone raised in the same house, who shared the same childhood, become the one responsible for such a crime? But this case was never straightforward. Almost immediately, questions of mental health shadowed the proceedings. Prosecutors pressed the facts. A sister killed, a crime committed, justice demanded. But Monica's defense team argued that she was not in control of her actions, that her mind was fractured, her grip on reality broken. Court hearings dragged on. Psychiatrists testified. Evaluations were ordered. Competency became the central question. Was Monica fit to stand trial? And if she was, could she truly be held responsible for what she had done? At the heart of the trial was a plea rarely seen, and even more, rarely accepted: insanity. Monica's lawyers argued that she should not be condemned as a murderer, but understood as a woman whose mental illness had spiraled into catastrophe. For the victim's family, the pain was almost unbearable. One sister was buried in the ground, the other sat in court, accused but claiming madness. Grief collided with disbelief. In the end, the verdict shocked many. Monica Pennington was acquitted not because she was innocent, but because she was found not guilty by reason of insanity. She would not walk free. Instead, she would be committed to a psychiatric facility, confined not by prison bars, but by locked hospital doors. The outcome left Middletown divided. Some saw justice in the recognition of her illness. Others saw only failure, a life taken, but no one punished in the way they expected. The tragedy of the Pennington case is layered. At its core, it is the story of two sisters. One who lost her life in the violence of a single night. Another who lost hers in the grip of a mind she could not control. And for the community of Middletown, it became a haunting reminder that sometimes the line between family and foe, between victim and killer, between sanity and madness, is paper thin. Saba Khan, sisters. To many, they are best friends, confidantes, protectors. But in May of 2016, in a modest family home in Luton, England, one sister became the executioner of the other. Her name was Saba Khan, and the motive? A deadly combination of jealousy, betrayal, and forbidden love. Saima Khan was 34 years old. She was a devoted mother of four, a respected community figure, and, above all, a caring sister. But she carried a secret burden. Her husband, Hafiz Rehman, was entangled in an affair, and the other woman, her own younger sister, 7-year-old Saba Khan. The affair had been simmering for years, hidden in the shadows of family gatherings and household visits. Saba wanted Hafiz for herself. She fantasized about taking her sister's place, becoming the wife, the mother, the one in control. But there was an obstacle: Saima herself. Saba's obsession turned dark. She began plotting, and on the night of May 23rd, 2016, she put her plan into action. As Saima prepared for bed, Saba waited. The house was quiet. The children were asleep. With a knife concealed, Saba lured her sister into a room, and then she attacked. Saima never stood a chance. Saba stabbed her 68 times. Each thrust of the blade more frenzied, more violent, more personal. Saima's body was left in a pool of blood. The brutality shocked even seasoned detectives. This wasn't a quick killing. This was rage unleashed. The children slept just rooms away, unaware that their mother's life was being ripped away by the aunt they trusted. After the murder, Saba tried to cover her tracks. She staged the scene to look like a break-in, smashing a window to throw suspicion off herself. But detectives weren't fooled. The sheer savagery of the attack told them this was no random burglary. This was personal. Forensic evidence quickly pointed back to Saba. Blood patterns, inconsistencies in her story, and soon the devastating truth emerged. The motive was Saima's husband. Saba had killed her sister to clear the way for her affair. The case ignited outrage across the UK. A sister killing another over a man, a husband betraying one sister with another. It was a story of betrayal that felt biblical. In court, the prosecution laid it bare. Saba was cold, calculated, and remorseless. She had executed her own sister in a frenzy of jealousy, then tried to lie her way out. When confronted with the evidence, she crumbled. She pleaded guilty to murder. The sentence: a minimum of 22 years in prison. Saima's children were left without a mother. Her family was left without a daughter. And the community was left grappling with the haunting reality that one sister's jealousy had obliterated an entire household's stability. Saba Khan wasn't a stranger in the night. She wasn't a burglar or a random attacker. She was blood. She was family. And when the knife came down, it wasn't just Saima's body that was destroyed. It was the bond of sisterhood itself. 2 sisters, 1 man, 1 knife, and a betrayal so deep it echoes far beyond Luton. In the end, Saba didn't just take her sister's life. She took her place, but only in the darkest way imaginable. Jasmia and Tasmia Whitehead Conyers, Georgia, January 13th, 2010. It was a school morning like any other until police were called to a quiet home where a scene of unimaginable brutality awaited them. Inside, the body of 4-year-old Jarmeka Nikki Whitehead was found in a pool of blood. She had been beaten, stabbed, and slashed in a frenzy of violence. The house looked like a war zone. The prime suspects weren't intruders. They weren't strangers. They were Nikki's own daughters, her twin girls, Jasmia and Tasmia, just 16 years old. To neighbors, the twins looked like bright, promising teenagers. smiling in photos, cheerleaders, seemingly normal. But inside the Whitehead home, the reality was much darker. Their relationship with their mother was toxic. Years of clashing, screaming matches, physical altercations. It was a household defined not by love, but by chaos. Nikki had struggled to control her daughters. At times, custody had shifted between her and the twins' grandmother. The tension never eased. On that cold January morning, it boiled over. According to later confessions, Nikki and the twins got into yet another argument. But this one escalated beyond control. Voices rose, tempers exploded. A struggle turned physical. The twins grabbed whatever weapons they could: knives, a heavy vase, anything within reach. The attack was vicious. Nikki fought back, clawing, biting, desperate to defend herself. The girls lashed out again and again, stabbing her, bludgeoning her, cutting her, until she could fight no more. The home was left spattered in blood. And Nikki Whitehead, the woman who had given them life, lay lifeless on the floor. When it was over, the twins faced the reality of what they had done. Panic set in. They concocted a story. To police, they claimed they had come home from school to discover their mother's body. They said it must have been a burglary gone wrong. But detectives weren't convinced. The crime scene told a different story. There were no signs of forced entry. The struggle clearly took place inside, between people who knew each other. And the girls' accounts didn't add up. As investigators dug deeper, the mask began to crack. They uncovered a history of violence between Nikki and her daughters. They learned of the screaming matches, the custody battles, the threats exchanged. And eventually, the pressure was too much. The twins confessed. They admitted they had killed their mother. They described the fight, the rage, the violence that spiraled out of control. The community was stunned. How could two young girls, just 16 years old, commit such a savage act against their own mother? The answer lay in years of dysfunction, in a home where love was drowned out by anger, where boundaries collapsed and resentment festered. The trial dragged on for years, with the twins sitting in custody as the legal process slowly unfolded. Finally, in 2014, they reached a plea deal. Both pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter, aggravated assault, and possession of a knife during the commission of a crime. Each was sentenced to 30 years in prison. To this day, the image of Jasmia and Tasmia, their identical faces, staring out from mugshots, haunts Georgia. Twins, once inseparable, forever defined not by their potential, but by the night they turned on their own mother. The Whitehead case stands as one of the most chilling examples of matricide in American history. Because the killers weren't hardened criminals. They weren't strangers lurking in the dark. They were daughters. And together, they destroyed the woman who had raised them. Gina Hahn Irvine, California, November 6th, 1996. In a quiet apartment complex, two-year-old Sunny Hahn lived what looked like a picture-perfect life. She was outgoing, ambitious, carving a future for herself. But across town, her identical twin sister, Gina Hahn, was plotting her destruction. The sisters' bond had once been unbreakable. Identical twins, inseparable as children, they had shared everything: clothes, secrets, dreams. But as they grew older, the closeness twisted into rivalry. Sunny was successful, confident, admired. Gina's life was unraveling financial problems, brushes with the law, an aimless path. Envy grew. Resentment hardened. By 1996, the relationship had collapsed completely, and Gina hatched a plan as shocking as it was cold. She would kill her sister. But it wasn't just about murder. Gina's alleged motive went further. She wanted to replace Sunny, to take her identity, her life, even her name. To do it, Gina recruited 2 teenage boys. Promising money and gifts, she convinced them to help her. Together, they stormed Sunny's apartment. Sunny was at home with a friend when the attack began. The intruders tied her up, gagged her, and held her at gunpoint. Sunny was terrified, but she was also resourceful. As the plan unfolded, she managed to keep her wits about her. At one point, she persuaded her captors to let her use the bathroom. From there, she made her move. She managed to alert a neighbor, who quickly called police. Officers raced to the scene. When they burst through the door, they found Sunny bound and terrified, and they found the evidence of Gina's plot: weapons, restraints, and the 2 teenage accomplices caught red-handed. Gina's plan had failed, but her betrayal was undeniable. In court, prosecutors painted her as manipulative, jealous, and obsessed with taking over her sister's life. The jury heard how she had orchestrated every detail, from recruiting the boys to planning Sunny's death. Sunny herself testified, describing the fear of that night and the chilling reality of facing her own twin as an enemy. The verdict was swift. Gina Han was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, burglary, false imprisonment, and firearm charges. The sentence: life in prison with the possibility of parole. The media dubbed her the evil twin. The story captivated the public. 2 identical sisters, mirror images of each other, one plotting to erase the other. The contrast was almost cinematic. Sunny, the good twin, radiant and successful. Gina, the evil twin, consumed by jealousy and willing to kill. Over the years, Gina's case continued to stir fascination. Books, TV specials, and documentaries all dissected the motives, the psychology, the horror of a twin willing to destroy the person who looked exactly like her. Sunny moved on, rebuilding her life, forever marked by betrayal. Gina sat in prison, carrying the weight of a label she could never escape. The Han case endures not just because of the crime itself, but because of what it symbolizes, that even the bond most people assume is unbreakable between identical twins can twist into something deadly. On that November night in Irvine, California, the phrase "blood is thicker than water" proved false. Because when envy and obsession collide, even a twin can become your worst enemy. Charlotte and Linda Mulhall, Dublin, Ireland, March 20th, 2005. St. Patrick's weekend. The city buzzed with celebrations, pubs overflowing with drink and music. But for 2 sisters, Charlotte and Linda Mulhall, that night would not end with laughter. It would end with one of the most notorious crimes in Irish history, a crime so grotesque, so shocking, that it earned them a name still whispered today: the Scissor Sisters. The story begins with their mother. Kathleen Mulhall was in a toxic relationship with a man named Farah Swaleh Noor. Noor was abusive, volatile, feared in the household. For years, he had terrorized Kathleen and her daughters. On that March night, Kathleen, Charlotte, Linda, and Noor sat together in a small Dublin flat. Alcohol flowed, drugs were taken, and then The tension snapped. An argument erupted. Noor grew aggressive. The sisters, fueled by anger, intoxication, and years of pent-up rage, fought back. What happened next was a whirlwind of violence. Charlotte and Linda attacked him. They grabbed knives, scissors, whatever they could find. The assault was brutal, frenzied, unstoppable. Noor was stabbed again and again until he lay dead on the floor. But it wasn't just the killing that horrified Ireland. It was what came next. Panic set in. A dead body on the carpet. The sisters faced a choice: call the police or cover it up. They chose the latter. Together, Charlotte and Linda dragged Noor's body into the bathroom, and in a scene that would haunt the Irish public for decades, they began to dismember him. His head, his limbs, his torso. Piece by piece, they carved him apart. They wrapped the remains in plastic bags, stuffed them into holdalls, and under the cover of night, carried them to the Royal Canal. One by one, they dumped the body parts into the dark water, hoping they would sink and be forgotten. But the canal did not keep their secret. Days later, the first bags surfaced, then more. Each discovery more gruesome than the last. A torso. Limbs. Eventually, investigators recovered Noor's remains. His head was never found. The media descended. The details spilled across headlines. The sisters who cut up their mother's boyfriend. The nation was transfixed, horrified, unable to look away. They were branded forever with a name that fused their gender with their weapon, the Scissor Sisters. In court, the story was laid bare. Charlotte was portrayed as the dominant force, the instigator, the one who drove the attack. Linda was described as weaker, submissive, swept up in her sister's rage. The jury agreed with the distinction. Charlotte Mulhall was convicted of murder. She received a life sentence. Linda Mulhall was convicted of manslaughter. She was sentenced to 15 years. Their mother, Kathleen, later admitted to helping clean the crime scene. The trial sent shockwaves through Ireland, not only for its brutality, but for its intimacy. This wasn't an underworld gangland killing. It wasn't a stranger's assault. It was two sisters in their mother's flat, tearing apart the man who had loomed over their lives. Some in Ireland saw them as monsters. Others saw them as desperate women, pushed beyond the brink by years of abuse. But no one could forget the images. Black plastic bags bobbing in the Royal Canal, detectives hauling human remains from the water. Charlotte remains in prison to this day. Linda, after serving her sentence, was released, but the name, the infamy, follows her still. Claire Miller. In the early hours of February 22, 2021, a quiet suburb of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, became the setting for a crime so disturbing, so senseless, that it shocked an entire nation. It wasn't a hardened criminal. It wasn't a masked intruder. It was a 4-year-old girl. And her victim? Her own sister. Her name was Claire Miller. On the surface, she looked like any other teenager. Dark hair, shy smile, headphones on, lost in her own world. But beneath that teenage exterior, something sinister was festering. Her sister, Helen Miller, was 19 years old, wheelchair-bound, non-verbal, severely disabled. To her parents, Helen was a light, a fragile soul who needed care, protection, and love, and Claire was supposed to be part of that circle of care, But on that winter night, Claire shattered it all. Around 1 a.m., Claire crept into Helen's bedroom. Snow was falling outside. The world was silent. In her hand, a kitchen knife. In the bed, her sister, defenseless, unable to move. Unable to scream, Claire pressed the blade into Helen's throat and stabbed. Over and over. Blood soaked the sheets. Helen's life ended within minutes. And then, something even more chilling happened. Instead of running, Claire calmly walked out of the house into the cold, fresh snow. She dialed 911, and with the voice of a child who didn't fully grasp the gravity of her actions, she confessed. "I stabbed my sister," she told the operator. Police rushed to the scene. When they arrived, Claire was waiting in the driveway. Her jeans were soaked, not with snow, but with her sister's blood. Inside the house, officers found Helen lifeless, the knife still buried in her neck. The responding officers were shaken. One described it as the most horrific crime scene he had ever witnessed, not because of the gore, but because of the sheer betrayal. A child killing her own sibling. But why? What could drive a 4-year-old girl to murder her disabled sister? Investigators dug into Claire's world. They found a teenager isolated, battling mental health issues, consumed by violent fantasies. In the weeks before the murder, Claire had posted cryptic messages online. Dark jokes, violent references, hints at a rage simmering beneath the surface. Yet nobody imagined it would manifest like this. The case gripped Pennsylvania. Headlines screamed, "1 4-year-old kills disabled sister." The public demanded answers. Was Claire a cold-blooded killer, or a mentally ill child who lost control? In court, prosecutors painted a chilling picture. Claire had planned this. She had waited until her parents were asleep. She had gone straight to Helen's room. She had targeted the most vulnerable person in the house, the one who couldn't fight back, couldn't scream, couldn't even beg for mercy. But the defense argued that Claire was not in her right mind, that she was suffering from severe psychiatric disorders. Ultimately, Claire entered a plea of guilty but mentally ill. The judge sentenced her to prison, where she will serve decades of her life behind bars. The Miller family was shattered. They lost not one daughter, but both. One murdered, one incarcerated. A family home turned into a crime scene that would haunt them forever. In Lancaster County, a sister's bedroom became a tomb, and the snow outside carried the footprints of a child who walked calmly away from a nightmare she herself created. Claire Miller wasn't just a sister, she became a killer, and Helen Miller never stood a chance. Megan Hargan. Now let's travel south of the border, to the affluent neighborhood of McLean, Virginia. Tree-lined streets, gated homes, a place where nothing bad is supposed to happen. But in July 2017, this community would wake up to news that was straight out of a nightmare. The Hargan family looked picture-perfect from the outside. Pamela Hargan, the mother, was successful and well-respected. Her daughters, Megan and Helen, were raised in privilege, but inside that house, tensions were boiling. Megan Hargan, the eldest, was in her mid-30s. She was a mother herself, but her life was riddled with instability, financial struggles, relationship problems, a sense that she never quite measured up. Then there was Helen Hargan, 23 years old, the youngest sister. Helen was beautiful, talented, and deeply loved by their mother. To many it was clear Helen was Pamela's favorite. And to Megan, that favoritism was unbearable. The resentment grew darker when money came into play. Megan began attempting fraudulent bank transfers from her mother's accounts, tens of thousands of dollars. But Pamela found out, and she was furious. Helen, too, was aware. For Megan, it wasn't just jealousy anymore, it was desperation. On the 14th of July 2017, a chilling 911 call reported a suspected murder-suicide at the Hargan home. When police arrived, they found the body of Pamela Hargan shot dead. Nearby, Helen lay lifeless, also shot. A handgun rested close to her. At first glance, it looked straightforward. Helen had killed her mother, then turned the gun on herself. But detectives had doubts. Something about the scene felt staged. First, the gun's position didn't match the wounds. The trajectory of the bullets told a different story. Helen's body lacked the telltale residue left by firing a weapon at close range. And then there was Megan present, distraught, but oddly inconsistent in her statements. Investigators dug deeper. What they discovered unraveled Megan's carefully constructed lie. She had made multiple attempts that very morning to transfer money out of her mother's accounts, nearly $400,000. She was desperate to secure the funds, and when her mother resisted, Megan chose the unthinkable path. She shot Pamela. Then, to cover her tracks, she killed Helen too, using her younger sister as a scapegoat. She arranged the crime scene to mimic a murder-suicide, hoping police would close the case quickly. She even fabricated digital trails to make Helen look unstable. But forensics doesn't lie. Neither does greed. Megan's banking records, her failed transfers, and the inconsistencies in her story painted a picture of cold-blooded calculation. The trial was gut-wrenching. The prosecution described Megan as manipulative, fueled by envy and financial desperation. The defense tried to paint her as misunderstood, but the evidence was overwhelming. In 2022, after a retrial, Megan was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. For the surviving family, the betrayal was almost too much to process. A mother and daughter gone, another daughter behind bars for life, a family shattered by one woman's greed. Helen's story is especially tragic. At just 23, her whole life lay ahead: dreams, relationships, the possibility of children, careers. Instead, she was silenced forever by someone who should have been her protector. Megan didn't just kill her. She tried to destroy her memory, framing her as a murderer in her final moments. And perhaps that's what makes this case so chilling. Megan wasn't driven by temporary rage. She planned, she calculated, she executed, all against her own blood. When police pieced it all together, one thing became clear. In McLean, Virginia, the most dangerous person in that house wasn't a masked intruder or a burglar in the night. It was Megan Hargan, the sister, smiling across the breakfast table. Karla Homolka. Imagine this. It's Christmas 1990. Snow covers the quiet suburbs of St. Catharines, Ontario. The Homolka family home is glowing with holiday warmth, laughter, presents, the smell of pine and mulled cider. It looks like the perfect Canadian family Christmas. But behind that cozy front door, something unspeakable is about to unfold. At the center of this story is Karla Homolka, a bright, attractive 20-year-old veterinary assistant. To her neighbors and friends, Carla was the golden girl. Blonde hair, big smile, bubbly personality. She seemed like someone destined for an ordinary, happy life. But appearances are deceiving. Carla had already fallen under the spell of Paul Bernardo, a man who was outwardly charming, but inwardly sadistic. Paul wasn't just controlling. He had obsessions, dark ones. He wanted to dominate, to humiliate, to destroy. And Carla, instead of running, she leaned in. She wanted to please him at all costs. So when Paul set his sights on someone new, someone shockingly close to her, Carla agreed to his fantasy. That someone was her own younger sister, Tammy Homolka. Tammy was just 15 years old. She adored her older sister, often tagging along behind her like a shadow. Tammy saw Carla as a role model, someone to aspire to. What she didn't know was that Carla was about to serve her up like a gift to Paul. It began innocently, or so it seemed. Paul complained to Carla that he wanted a virgin, someone pure, someone untouched. Carla was already sexually submissive to Paul, and in a twisted attempt to prove her devotion, she offered Tammy, yes, her own flesh and blood. Carla worked at a veterinary clinic, where she had access to sedatives. She stole a bottle of halothane, an anesthetic meant for animals. It would soon become a weapon. December 23rd, 1990. After a long evening of family festivities, Tammy joined Carla and Paul in the basement. They suggested she have a drink, just harmless fun between siblings and her boyfriend. But hidden in that cup was the stolen sedative. Tammy started to feel woozy, dizzy. Her words slurred. Her body failed her. That's when the nightmare began. Paul and Carla dragged Tammy into the basement bedroom. They laid her unconscious body on the floor. While her parents and other siblings slept peacefully upstairs, Paul began to assault Tammy. Carla didn't stop him. In fact, she helped holding the halothane-soaked cloth over Tammy's face to keep her unconscious. But something went wrong. Tammy started to gag. She vomited. The chemicals burned her throat, searing her insides. She struggled for air. Paul panicked. Carla panicked. They tried to clean her up, redress her, and carry her upstairs as if they'd discovered her in distress. By the time emergency services arrived, it was too late. Tammy Homolka was dead. The official ruling? Accidental death by choking on vomit, aggravated by alcohol consumption. The truth that she had been drugged, suffocated, and raped by her sister's boyfriend with her sister's assistance remained buried. Tammy was laid to rest, and her parents clung to the belief that it was nothing more than a tragic accident. But Carla and Paul knew better. In fact, they filmed the assault. They kept it as a trophy. To them, Tammy's death wasn't the end, it was the beginning. The pair would go on to become two of Canada's most notorious serial killers, later dubbed the Ken and Barbie Killers. Years later, when Paul was arrested and investigators unearthed the videotapes, the horrific truth about Tammy's death surfaced. Carla, once seen as a victim of Paul's control, was revealed to have been an active participant. She had delivered her younger sister into the hands of a predator. She had smiled while her sibling suffocated. The Canadian public was outraged. A sister's role is to protect, to nurture, to stand guard over their younger siblings. Carla had done the opposite. She had betrayed Tammy in the most grotesque way possible. And here's the twist that still sparks anger today. Carla struck a deal with prosecutors. In exchange for testifying against Paul, she received just 12 years in prison. She served her time, changed her name, and today she walks free, living a life her sister never got to have. Tammy's death isn't just another tragic homicide. It's a story about the collapse of family bonds, about how jealousy, submission, and twisted love can transform a sister into a killer. When people say the devil wears a friendly face, in this case, the devil was wearing a sister's smile. The Khachaturian Sisters, Moscow, July 27th, 2018. On the surface, it was just another sweltering summer night in the Russian capital. But in one apartment, the decades-long nightmare of 3 young women was about to erupt in blood. Their names were Kristina, Angelina, and Maria Khachaturian. Their victim was not a stranger, not an intruder, not even an enemy in the usual sense. Their victim was their father, and his death would ignite one of the most explosive debates Russia has ever faced about family, abuse, and survival. To outsiders, the Khachaturians looked like a typical family, a father raising 3 daughters, a modest life in Moscow. But behind the closed doors of their apartment, the reality was unspeakable. For years, Mikhail Khachaturian terrorized his children. His daughters described a household where every day was marked by violence, threats, and fear. They spoke of brutal beatings, of psychological torment, of being treated not as daughters, but as prisoners. Worse still, they alleged something even darker, that their father subjected them to sexual abuse, repeatedly, relentlessly. For the Khachaturian sisters, the apartment wasn't a home. It was a dungeon. By the summer of 2018, the abuse had escalated beyond what they could bear. The girls, still teenagers, just 17, 18, and 19 years old, believed there was no escape, no help from the outside, no protection from authorities. Because in Russia, domestic violence laws had been gutted in recent years. Police often dismissed complaints. Women were left defenseless. And for the Khachaturian sisters, reporting their father's crimes seemed futile. They were trapped. So, on that hot July evening, they made their choice. According to investigators, the sisters waited until their father was dozing in a chair. Then, armed with knives and a hammer, they attacked. The assault was frenzied, years of rage and fear exploding all at once. Mikhail was stabbed dozens of times. When it was over, his body slumped lifeless, and the apartment that had been their prison became a crime scene. The sisters did not flee. They did not hide. They called the police themselves, confessing what they had done. To officers, they told their story. Years of abuse, years of torment, years of living in constant terror. Their arrest made headlines instantly, but what happened next was unlike any other case. Because instead of the usual narrative daughters as cold-blooded killers, millions saw them differently, not as murderers, but as survivors. Survivors who had finally snapped under the weight of unending abuse. The Russian public erupted in outrage. How could these girls be charged with murder when the system had failed to protect them in the first place? Protests broke out. Supporters flooded the streets, holding signs that read, "We are all the Khachaturian sisters." Women's rights groups demanded justice not against the sisters, but against the man who had abused them for years. Yet the legal system was not so sympathetic. prosecutors insisted the sisters had committed premeditated murder. They argued the attack was not self-defense because their father had not been actively threatening them at that exact moment. They wanted the girls punished, regardless of the years of abuse. The defense countered with a stark truth. Self-defense doesn't always happen in the split second of an attack. Sometimes, it's the culmination of years of terror, when the only escape is to strike back before it happens again. The case dragged through the courts, delayed, debated, dissected. Each hearing revealed more horror about what life inside the Khachaturian household had been. Each testimony fueled the public's anger at a system that seemed more interested in punishing victims than protecting them. The sisters themselves sat in court, young and fragile, their lives already destroyed, their futures uncertain. They admitted to the killing. They did not deny what they had done, but they begged for the world to understand why, and in many ways, the world did. International human rights organizations condemned the prosecution. Women across Russia identified with the sisters' plight. It wasn't just their case anymore, it was a symbol of a much larger crisis, a country where domestic abuse victims had nowhere to turn, a society where silence often meant survival. For the Khachaturian sisters, the trial is not just about their freedom. It's about rewriting the meaning of justice in a country that has long ignored the suffering of women behind closed doors. But the legal battle continues. As of today, the sisters still face charges. Their fate hangs in the balance. They could walk free, recognized as victims who acted in desperation, or they could spend decades behind bars, condemned for choosing survival over submission. What is undeniable is this. On July 27, 2018, 3 sisters made a choice no child should ever have to make: to end the life of the man who had given them life, to turn their rage, their fear, their desperation against their own father. For some, it was murder. For others, it was justice. For the sisters themselves, it was the only way out. And in Russia, the debate still rages. Were they killers, or were they victims who fought back the only way they knew how? The story of the Khachaturian sisters is more than a crime. It's a mirror held up to a society that failed them, a story where innocence was stolen, silence was forced, and survival came at the cost of blood. And until the final verdict is spoken, their names will echo not just in Moscow, but around the world, as a reminder of what happens when the law turns its back on those who need it most.